We're very, very grateful to be here. Let me begin by, first of all, congratulating anybody who managed not to fall asleep during the introduction of me. I promise you that we're about to get on to the interesting panelists in just a moment, but Michael, you could not have been more gracious in the way that you introduced me, and I do appreciate it. I'd also like to express personally my profound appreciation for every member of the armed forces who's on this call today. I know that we're in touch with people from the United States Army. When I say that we consider it a high privilege to be able to address ourselves to you, and most importantly, to learn by way of your questions following the initial interview, I really do mean it. And I mean it not just in my name, but also on behalf of my colleague and co-founder, Rosita Panini. Rosita is on this call, co-founder of the Miriam Institute. Thank you, Rosita, for everything that you do to enable us to undertake our work. And I also want to thank our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer, our great and powerful colleague, for coordinating this. Now, just before I introduce everybody, particular thanks to Major Zach Landis. Thank you, Zach, so very much for giving us an opportunity to address ourselves to you over at Fort Gordon. We really, really do appreciate it. We hope that you and your family are doing well. So let me introduce our panelists one by one. I'm going to start with Major General Noam Tibon. Major General Noam Tibon spent his military career specializing in counterterrorism and homeland security. His command positions in the Israel Defense Forces include service as commander of the 202nd Battalion of the Paratroopers Brigade, deputy commander of the Paratroopers Brigade, commander of the Etzion Regional Brigade, commander of the Judea Regional Brigade, commander of the Nachal Brigade, head of the Personnel Division of the Israel Defense Forces Ground Forces, chief of the Infantry and Paratroopers Corps, commander of the Judea and Samaria Division, and commander of the Command and Staff College of the Israel Defense Forces. His most recent military position was commander of the Northern Formation with a special focus on the Lebanon front. He concluded his service at the rank of Major General, and General Tibon holds a BA in History from the University of Haifa, where he graduated summa cum laude, and an MA in Public Administration from Harvard University, where he also graduated summa cum laude. He is a graduate of the Command and Staff College of the Israel Defense Forces and of the United States Marine Corps University Command and Staff College. He's a great many things. I think of him as a mentor, and I also think of him as something of an historian. And Major General Tibon, I'm very grateful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us today. I'd also like to introduce our second panelist, Colonel Eli Baron. Eli Baron, who has done us the kind favor of going to his municipal library for the purpose of this webinar today. That's actually Eli Baron's living room. He's what's called a man of the book, and rare is the time that you will raise a subject to which Eli can't turn his expertise and analysis and enrich a conversation by way of those things. So Eli, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Eli concluded his career in the Israel Defense Forces, holding the position of instructor at the IDF National Defense College, the INDC. There he was tasked with mentoring both the group and individual studies of senior select officials from within Israel and the international community, with a particular focus on matters of national security, strategy, international relations, and economics. Prior to that position, Eli served as the Deputy Military Advocate General of the Israel Defense Forces from 2012 to 2015, where he was in command of approximately 1,000 lawyers. Can you think of anything worse than that? He was in command of approximately 1,000 lawyers and legal experts, including prior to, during, and following Operation Pillar of Defense and Operation Protective Edge. He also served as the chief legal advisor for the Israel Defense Forces in the West Bank from 2009 to 2012. He's a prolific lecturer, and he has provided expert presentations to hundreds of high-level international delegations in Israel and throughout the international community. He's a graduate of Tel Aviv University, where he was awarded a Bachelor of Laws and later on an Executive Master of Business Administration, where he graduated cum laude. In 2016, he received a master's degree in political science, where he again graduated cum laude. He's a graduate of the National Defense College of the Israel Defense Forces, and we're delighted to have you here with us, Colonel Baron. Thank you very much indeed. And before I get to our first question, I want to introduce somebody who is a scholar, who is a teacher, who is an author, and generally an all-round good egg who I have had the privilege of sitting in the lectures of and have learned by way of his teaching, particularly coming as it does in his capacity as what I would describe as a professor of practice, Dr. Samir Puri. Now, Dr. Samir Puri has worked in government and in academia. In 2018 to 2019, he was assistant head of research at the Development Concepts and Doctrines Centre, the British Ministry of Defence's think tank. In 2017, he authored the Commonwealth Secretariat's strategy on countering violent extremism. His academic posts include lecturer in war studies at King's College in London and adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, SAIS, Europe. Earlier in his career, Samir worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where his assignments covered counterterrorism policy and a year-long secondment with the OSCE to monitor the war in East Ukraine. We're going to be talking about that with you, Samir. His career began as a defense analyst at RAND Europe. In 2016, Samir authored an IISS Adelphi book entitled Fighting and Negotiating with Armed Groups. His latest book is The Great Imperial Hangover, How Empires Have Shaped the World. That's published by Atlantic Books in 2020. He is based currently in the IISS Asia office in Singapore, and he's responsible for furthering research within the IISS on hybrid warfare, urban security, and armed conflict. Thank you so very much for being with us, Dr. Puri Samir. So I'm going to dive in with the first question. Ladies and gentlemen, just a quick note to all of you. Don't be backward in coming forward with your questions. You can type them in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand, and at the end of the first hour of this, we will start unmuting you, and you can ask your questions live of the participants. I know a number of you are gathered around one screen, so please just feel free to raise your hand, and whomever is the individual who wants to ask the question should go right ahead. But please do bombard these speakers with your questions. The subject today is the changing nature of modern warfare. Now, I'm going to begin with a question just to give everybody a little bit more background, and I'm going to pose it first and foremost, if I may, to Major General Noam Tibon. So, Noam, may I call you Noam by your first name for the purposes of this call?
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So Noam, you're somebody with extensive experience working alongside the United States of America. You're also a graduate of the Kennedy School, as we heard during the introduction. I'd like you, please, to just talk to us candidly about the relationship that you have with the United States of America, and also the relationship between the US and the State of Israel, and just what it is that means to you as an individual, as a general, as a citizen of Israel, and of course, as a citizen of the world.
Okay. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure and a great honor for me to talk with American military, which I highly respect. I was born and raised in Israel. My parents' families came from Germany, my mother, and Hungary, my father. Both of them were lucky because they left Europe before the Holocaust. And both my parents grew up in Jerusalem under the British Mandate. And when they were 18, after high school, they joined the Palmach, the first units of the Israeli Defense Forces. They fought in the 1948 Independence War, and then they go and build their kibbutz in order to guard the road to Jerusalem. And I grew up on that kibbutz somewhere between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I joined the Special Forces after finished high school and started my military career. When we talk about Israel, basic, fundamental strategy, Israel is a small country surrounded by enemies. We always seek for the support of a superpower in the world. This is started already with Ben-Gurion in 1948. And basically the first superpower who supported Israel was France. But afterward, basically the relationship between Israel and the United States have become so strong and so friendly that we really see America as our big brother and our best ally in the world. And I think that, and I think and hope that Americans feel the same way when they look at the Middle East about Israel. That, you know, if there is a place where you can trust in the Middle East, is always as a friend is Israel. I was lucky to be in America twice in uniform. The first tour was a fantastic tour in the Marine Corps Command and Staff College in Quantico, Virginia. And basically, on those days, you know, the Marines talk about 911, which means basically if there is problem somewhere in the world, they are ready to go. And I learned a lot in this wonderful experience. My second tour in America was a unique tour at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And this was really a dramatic year because this was the year of September 11. And I saw in my own eyes how America changed dramatically. And basically, I always like to talk with Americans, and this will conclude my beginning. A small story about my dog, Buddy. You know, when I came to America with my family, I came straight from being the commander of the Hebron Brigade, which is a hot spot in the West Bank. It was the second Intifada, so I was really facing a lot of terror attacks, suicide attacks all over. And, you know, Benjamin and especially Eli knows a lot about this period of time. And the IDF told me, you know, you worked hard, go for a year at Harvard and come back, you know, with full charge. And so, you know, when you take a dog with you, you have to buy a cage, a special cage. So we bought a special cage for our dog, Buddy. He was a boxer. And we flew to Boston through London. So we waited a few hours in Heathrow and then took another plane to Boston. So when we landed at Logan Airport, you know, all the suitcase came, and then the cage came and it's empty. So, you know, everybody was, what the heck? And then, you know, I got what we call direct order from my wife. Go and find him. So, you know, this is an order that you have to obey. So I went all the way to the plane. I went on the plane. I went, you know, to see where the luggage are. I went to the runway. Nobody asked me, who am I? What am I doing? Nothing. So, you know, I was there for about half an hour, whistling, you know, on the runway, Buddy, and nobody asked me, who am I and what am I doing there? So after half an hour, I'm coming back. And then, you know, I told my wife, maybe Buddy was afraid of the winter in Boston. He preferred to stay in London. Nobody laughed. And then suddenly, you know, we saw, you know, a group of 4 or 5 big football players with a huge cage, you know, and they carrying a Buddy in this huge cage. And it seemed that in the UK, there is a very strong dog lovers. And they thought that the cage is too small. So they upgrade him to first class. So he came with a blanket and everything was, you know, everybody was happy. But I remember on my way to the hotel, I told my wife, listen, Gali, Americans are crazy. Nobody, you know, in Israel, we were in a huge terror attack. And here in America, nobody asked, who am I? What am I doing? I went on the plane, nobody checked, nothing. And a few months later, from the same Logan Airport, we have the terrible attack of September 11, which basically changed the world. And I think America changed dramatically since then as well. So if you ask me, what is change? It all starts there in September 11, and I think we're going to have a unique conversation today.
Thank you very much, Noam, and I appreciate you sharing some of your experience with that. I want to turn now to you, Eli, and I assume I have your permission to call you by your first name. In fact, I'm going to be doing that for all three of you. Eli, you're somebody whose legal expertise has not only informed several of Israel's most recent conflicts, but just to internationalize the conversation a bit, your expertise and your findings with regards to the law of armed conflict have been shared pretty extensively with Israel's allies, including the United States of America. It's been transmitted to them and presented by you in person, including to relevant parties at the Pentagon, I believe. Can you tell us about your relationship working with your counterparts in the United States and perhaps other democratic states about how the law of armed conflict and its application in the modern battlefield has heightened the need for coordination between Israel and her allies, including the United States of America, and how it might impact upon the service experiences of the people listening to this call today?
Sure. Thank you. Let me just start by thanking the Miriam Institute and you personally, Benjamin and Ms. Pnini. We've been working together for years now, and it's always been a pleasure. I also congratulate my co-panelists, Major General T-Bone, who's an old friend of mine, and I highly appreciate him. And of course, Professor Puri. I'm looking forward to learning from both of you. And I want to also thank all the participants from Fort Gordon. Thank you for your service. God bless you. I've had the privilege of working for many, many years with all branches of the American military. And in the legal profession, especially when we talk about spheres of international law, it is very important that like-minded states will be able to communicate with one another, to have a dialogue regarding the interpretations and the development of international law. As we all know, the international law is a living creature. It always evolves, and many of the directions in which it's going are directions that are dictated by state practices. Israel and the US in many ways find themselves always on the same side of the aisle when it comes to interpreting international law. And if I may say, in many times, there are not too many parties in that side of the aisle. We share the same challenges in many of the conflicts that we've had at least in the last 2 decades. Major General T-Bone has mentioned 9/11. Obviously, all the conflicts that America was engaging ever since and still is in Afghanistan, for instance, have made America contend with various challenges regarding to the new warfare, the modern warfare, and a modern interpretation of international law, which many of the treaties that serve as a basis for the principles of that law were drafted like 70 years ago or 40 years ago. Many of them became a little bit obsolete, so new interpretations were needed. And I had the privilege to maintain an ongoing dialogue with my peers in all branches of the military. And it's always been tremendously beneficial for both parties, both for Israelis and for Americans, to know that we have each other to consult with and to back in international conferences, and to make sure that the national security interests of both nations are maintained through our dialogue regarding international law.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And now I want to come to you, Samir, because I want to dive in on a different perspective that you bring to this conversation. You can really help us to broaden the lens, if you like, or pull back the lens. Because as I said in the outset, you're joining us from Singapore today, and you're particularly focused on the subject or area of Asia Pacific. But that wasn't your primary introduction into the changing nature of modern warfare. I'll come a little bit to that or to that a little bit later on. But for a moment, I'd like you to just tell us about your specific area of focus at this time. What was it that induced your travel over there to Singapore, and what is it that you're looking at right now? I think you're muted, Samir. I think you're muted. No, I can't hear you. Alan, are we able to unmute Samir?
He's not muted. His microphone actually just went out on his headphones. So I'm going to ask him to unplug and just go back to the regular audio on the computer.
There you go, Samir. We hear you clearly.
Is that better?
Yep, go for it.
Sure, sorry about that. Just want to start by saying thanks very much to Benjamin. It's very nice to be reacquainted, in fact, via this talk with you. And also to send my greetings to all of the attendees. I'm really pleased to be able to address the members of the Fort Gordon training cohort. And I hope I'll be able to add some very different perspectives, as Benjamin is saying, to what you're going to be hearing. So why did I end up in Singapore? Well, obviously the weather is one reason, but there are some professional reasons as well as to why I've ended up here. I'm working for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a very well-established London headquartered security think tank. It's been in operation since the late 1950s. And it's interesting, like all organizations that are involved in studying armed conflict, very rapidly you find that existing assumptions can become outdated. And there's a post-Cold War generation. There's a post 9/11 generation. And what's really interesting, and this dates me, and I'm not particularly that old, is that it's nearly 20 years since 9/11 and since Noam's mentioning of 9/11. It was astonishing when we were reading that the first US service personnel were deploying to Afghanistan, and British personnel as well, who had not been born when the 9/11 attacks happened, 18, 19-year-old privates and specialists. Really mind-blowing. I was an undergraduate at university. But 2 decades have gone on, and despite the fact the forever wars are still carrying on, to use that term, has shifted. And of course, the threat from state actors is now of a different nature compared to 20 years ago when the focus was exclusively on non-state actors. And so, Benjamin, what's really moved me to the Asia Pacific is not that I have any deep regional expertise, but we'll go back and talk about Ukraine and that conflict in a bit in the future, a bit later on. I spent a year immersed in East Ukraine, actually on the ground. This was the first of the hybrid wars. Depends on how you like that term or not. But really what I'll be doing in the Asia Pacific region is looking at the potential for the onset of hybrid wars, or the potential for hybrid warfare techniques to be used not only by China, but by a variety of state actors as a way of expressing grievances and redressing grievances without actually risking World War III. Because that's ultimately where we are. Hybrid wars do indicate that there isn't the potential for a direct state-on-state clash of World War II proportions. And of course, the nuclear weapons that we have do guarantee some degree of stability. But the world is an increasingly unstable and unpredictable place. And the unpredictability means that war could break out from disputes that don't even seem to be particularly holding that potential, as we saw in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Simon. Now, actually, I'm going to pick up on that point and ask you to speak to that. And then, Noam, I'm going to come back to you. Ladies and gentlemen who are listening, the reason that I've taken the time to introduce these 3 speakers is because it gives us the opportunity to talk about 3 areas, 3 theaters, if you like, that do pertain to actions of the United States Armed Forces. So you've got Asia Pacific, you've got also Russia and Ukraine, and of course, the Middle East. So Samir, let me push you a little bit on this term hybrid warfare, and I'm going to divide this conversation into 3 parts. Hybrid warfare is a term that you've actually voiced a little bit of disappointment with. You don't think that it's really a particularly specific term of art. In fact, you've spoken about the fact that prior to your deployment to the Ukraine, people weren't speaking about hybrid warfare, and now it's an absolute fixture in the lexicon of the modern battlefield. Tell us about how you define hybrid warfare and how you came across it and saw it with regard to Ukraine. And then Noam, I'm going to ask you to do the very same with regard to Lebanon.
Oh, Benjamin, that's a great point to start on. And just to help the audience understand, so I was a British Foreign Service officer, civilian, and when the Ukraine war broke out, I sort of requested a secondment out to the OSCE, which is an organization quite a few of you will know, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was the diplomatic vehicle that was used by the Russian, American, British, and other governments to have a monitoring presence in the Donbass, and actually not in the Crimea, but just north of the Crimea, so straight after the war broke out. The OSCE is not a military organization, but as you can imagine, a lot of my colleagues doing the monitoring work were former artillery officers, former infantry officers from a variety of nations. And our job was to monitor the adherence, or indeed the breaking of, the ceasefire that the separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, the breakaway republics, the Russian government as well as the Ukrainian government had all nominally signed up to. Benjamin, the point of hybrid war is that the term, there's moments when jargon starts to become pretty unavoidable. And just 10 years ago, you couldn't walk for 2 paces without bumping into the phrase COIN, counterinsurgency, for better or for worse. It became a shorthand for explaining things that perhaps were better explained in their own terms, rather than saying, if you slap COIN onto it, it'll get funding approval. If you slap COIN onto it, you can dress up something old as something relevant. Well, with hybrid war, because the way Russia approached it, such a seismic shock, certainly to the European powers, because they annexed territory. This is, the 19th century saw annexations of territory. Early 20th century, the imperial era is over. So this was a real shock that Russia could pull this off. The term has merits and it has demerits. The merits that it has, and I'm going to be really looking forward to hearing Major General Noam's comments on this shortly, is the original term was developed by a retired US Marine Corps officer, Frank Hoffman, in about 2006, and he used the 2006 war with Hezbollah as one of his examples, and he wanted to bring to the people's attention that there aren't just big conventional wars or small irregular wars. There's going to be mixes and matches where non-state actors are heavily funded by states and use state-level weaponry, rocketry, maybe even air power. That might be something we see with UAVs. But the flip side is that states might verge to using criminal groups, gangs, proxy militias that they have superficial deniability. So it can go in both directions. So that perspective is actually quite important because it speaks a lot to the topic of this panel, which is a changing character of conflict. The slight problem I have with the term is that when was warfare ever single method? I mean, by the notion hybrid means combination. Does that mean we say that Hitler's blitzkrieg was a hybrid war because he had air power and tanks? Strategy is always about combining different operational elements in some kind of synchronicity to achieve your ends. Just to round off my answer, Benjamin, I think the Ukraine experience, which we can talk about a bit more later on, hybrid war sounds very futuristic, but believe me when I tell you, there were tanks, there were trenches, there was artillery pieces, multiple launch rocket systems, the stuff that was like outdated equipment being used. So when we say hybrid war, there was also a kinetic positional conflict being fought. It wasn't only being fought for the cameras, it was a real shooting match, and 10,000 plus people have died. So we need to, I think, just keep in mind some things change and other things don't.
Thank you very much. And Noam, you started your introduction to this audience by looking back to the era pre 9/11. Now, from that point to this point, can you tell us how you define hybrid warfare and how it's become central, if you think it has become central, to the changing nature of modern warfare, with regard perhaps to Lebanon, if you would?
Okay, the terms that we use today in Israel is not hybrid warfare, but the war between the worlds, which means how to protect the interest of Israel, and I will use Syria as an example, how to do a war which will be focused to protect your interest without bringing us to a big conventional war. And this idea, which basically based on a lot of intelligence that you can highlight what are your targets. This is number one. Number two, use a lot of air power, airstrikes. And number three, to use special forces. And to use all of those in a quiet way that will not lead you to a conventional war when you use divisions and tanks, etc. So this is basically, and I will give you this example, because I think, what Israel is doing, I think America is doing in other places in the world. For example, when you look at Syria today, Israel is focusing on two major targets. Target number one is to prevent the Hezbollah from guided missiles that Iran is trying to smuggle to Lebanon through Syria. So you focus on those guided missiles and you conduct a lot of strike attacks, air attacks, special forces attacks to prevent this capability from Hezbollah. But you do it in a way that it's not hurting a lot of people. It's very focused. It's very limited to the target. The other, and maybe number one, strategic goal of Israel today in Syria is to send the Iranian forces back home, or take the Iranian Revolutionary Guard out of Syria, and especially out of our northern border in the Golan Heights. So again, you conduct all kinds of very guided attacks by air or by special forces, that it will be in a way under smoke, that nobody will really understand who is doing it, when it's going to happen, and you create a mechanism that from time to time you hit a target. And this is very, very important. And I think when you look in this, hybrid war, or what we call the war between the wars, is what we call you target a leader. And I want to talk about Qasem Soleimani, which I think was enormous, successful American attack, because sometimes you have one individual which is a leader, a true leader of a terror organization, a very capable man with a lot of self-confidence, very experienced. And when you take him out of the equation, it really changed the nature of the whole organization. And again, when you do it on the right time and you target only him, and you are not hit civilians or uninvolved people, this has also a huge, huge effect. And when we are talking today about this hybrid war, I think this is a good example how it works on daily life.
Thank you very much. Now, Eli, you come to this subject with particular expertise in the area of law and the law of armed conflict. I think it's interesting that already there's a bit of disagreement or differing perspectives on what this term hybrid war means, or the war between the wars. It speaks to the complexity that's at play. And one of the areas that there's added complexity is certainly with regard to the legal ability of democratic states to deploy their armed forces against non-state actors or against enemies in the field. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about some of the legal complexities that have come about by way of hybrid warfare. And you can certainly do so. I know that you're able to turn your hand to the issue of Ukraine as well, but I'd like you to talk about Gaza, maybe Syria, and then the Ukraine. And then I'm going to come back to Samir to talk a little bit about his experiences there.
Sure. So usually when we talk about wars, we will usually look at two distinct bodies of the law. One which we will call as jus ad bellum, which is the norms that countries have to follow before setting out to conflict, namely when exactly you can use force in your foreign relations with another state, and when you can defend yourself after having experienced an armed attack by another state. And the other body of law is the jus in bello, which is the rules that all countries, all parties to a conflict have to obey while being in an armed conflict. Now, all these rules were drafted in the late 19th century and 20th century. And many of the things that both Samir and Noam have mentioned in what they said were not things that the drafters of the treaties of the laws of armed conflict had in mind back then. So if we look at Samir has mentioned the conflict in Ukraine, and in my opinion, that's a perfect example for a hybrid warfare, because if you look at, most people will tell you that was a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but Russia will tell you we're not part of this conflict. We never sent our soldiers over there. There's this term that that commentators were using, little green men, okay, because there were Russian troops operating in Crimea, for instance, or in eastern Ukraine. They never wore a uniform. They were basically using also the local Russian ethnic groups that were supporting them, and it gave them a space of deniability, of saying we're not part of this conflict. At the same time, they were not using only military tactics, but also cyber operations. They were using troll farms to influence Ukrainian politics. They were hacking into the Ukrainian electricity network. There was a shutdown of 6 hours sometime, I think 5 years ago or something. Almost 250,000 people had no electricity for a few hours. So how exactly do you treat all those incidents with the tools of mid 20th century? How do you treat a cyber operation in the tools of warfare? Is this an armed attack? Can Ukraine react with an armed attack of its own to defend itself against what they see as a Russian aggression? And also, if you look at everything that Noam was mentioning, the campaign between the wars in Syria, for instance. So he mentioned both two different kinds of targets: Hezbollah fighters and Iranian proxy groups operating in Syria, or Iranian officers, the Revolutionary Guard Corps officers operating in Syria. So if according to foreign sources, Israel attacks any of these groups in Syria, what exactly is the framework, the legal framework that defines those attacks? If we look at Hezbollah, Israel will maintain that legally it has a protracted armed conflict with Hezbollah. It started at least before 2006 in the Second Lebanon War. It never stopped. There were always several military incidents between Israel and Hezbollah, and Israel might say that there are no geographic boundaries for this conflict, and it has the right to defend itself also in Syria, where Hezbollah is trying to sway hold in the Syrian Golan, have military outposts on the Israeli border, etc. But what about Iran? Israel is not officially in an armed conflict with Iran, and I would dare to say that neither side would like to declare an armed conflict. So even if factually you might say that the definition of the the status between those two countries is an armed conflict, neither state is willing to declare or confirm a state of armed conflict between the two sides, although there were numerous military confrontations between them. So I think all those incidents stretch the boundaries of the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, and they necessitate new interpretations for the old rules that we use. And it's very interesting to follow. We might get into more details later, to follow the way international lawyers try to deal with cyber operations, the way they used old rules to deal with new weapons, for instance, autonomous weapon systems that are being more and more used by Western powers, etc. So I think it all, this is the last decade specifically has been fascinating in terms of international law and the way it tries to deal with new tools of modern warfare. Benjamin, I can't hear you.
Sorry, thank you very much. Thank you, Eli. So Samir, let's pick up with the issue of little green men operating. This idea of operatives who are ununiformed or who do not bear the insignia of a given state has caused many, many problems for other states when it comes to blocking the ambitions of, for example, Russia in Crimea. It's certainly been the case with regard to the Israel Defense Forces as they fight Hezbollah and Hamas. Tell us a little bit about how the approach of the Russians rendered the international community, quite frankly, ill-equipped to really push back the Russian ambitions on itself, if you would. And if you can, bring America into that aspect as well, given our audience.
Certainly, Benjamin. Just before...
I can hear you. I can hear you.
You can? Yeah. I actually just want to agree with one of Eli's points about how outdated a lot of the structures and assumptions we have. Warfare is always about adaptation and innovation. Soldiers are sometimes the best innovators because they're doing so under fire. And as a result, things can move forward very quickly simply because people on the ground are finding innovative ways around obstacles. And always like this, a visual analogy, which I use with some of my students, is that the world of international arrangements, international law, and indeed nuclear deterrence, imagine this like the big paving stones in a garden. But war is like weed, and it somehow still finds a way to grow between those organized paving stones. And this, I think, is unfortunately an immutable law of the human condition. Of course, I wish it wasn't. I wish I was going to the unemployment office and saying I was a former war studies lecturer and there's no more wars. But sadly, war finds a way back into the international system, no matter the supposed stability that we get back. Benjamin, your question about how to counter superficially deniable gambits and techniques, well, I mean, this, of course, is one of the biggest problems that we've got. This idea of the previous speakers have just mentioned that Russia was not only, saying that these are service personnel of ours who are going there on their own volition during their leave periods and denying all culpability. Interestingly, the Minsk agreement, which was a ceasefire deal that my organization, the OSCE, were monitoring, explicitly failed to mention Russia as an aggressor. It was specifically about the supposed spontaneous indigenous uprising of Eastern Ukrainians and the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, no peace deal is ever going to succeed if it fails to name the actual states that are culpable. That's clearly the case. So as a result, you have this interesting situation where the international, the peace deal that was signed, a diplomatically accredited arrangement, did not reflect ground realities. And this is precisely what hybrid warfare is about. It's about creating situations on the ground that you can never pin those who are culpable for down for. And so you're winning not only battlefield encounters or holding off sufficiently for enough time on the battlefield, you're also winning the rhetorical arguments and you're staving off pressure. Because let's face it, the conflicts, they're not all encompassing. This is not World War II. These are often theater-specific conflicts. And of course, they're devastating in those theaters. But I was struck in Ukraine how peaceful it was in Kiev and in the south and certainly in the west, and actually the war zone was very much confined to a certain space. And I'm no expert on southern Lebanon, but I have visited, actually on holiday, in fact, to Sidon and Tyre. And I'm amazed when you see the geography there. This was actually during a lull in hostilities in 2014. It was actually all in Syria, which meant I didn't go to Baalbek. I very much did want to go to Baalbek, but I decided to cross it off my itinerary because I didn't think it was a bit too close to Syria. And again, with the southern Lebanon front, it's a particular theatre. And so what you've got is a situation in which state and non-state actors can conspire to create, quite a hazardous situation. But they effectively want to also say, well, there's also business as usual, and you can't pin us down. And there's something else with hybrid war, Ben, just to round off my answer, which I think is important, is if we're talking about Russia or we're talking about Iran, we're talking about how they back proxies or build proxies out of nowhere, which I think is a commonality in these case studies, although the goals and the stakes are very different, the regions are incomparable. Then you also need to look not just at the operational and tactical, and this is hopefully speaks to some of the ambitions of this session, we need to also rehouse these operations within the wider statecraft of those countries, who want maybe greater regional hegemony, greater regional influence. And the statecraft for Russia, and indeed for Iran, is to be able to, clearly be very, two-faced, which is to be able to support aggressive maneuvers with deniable culpability, but then also to play the international game. Just to round off this answer, to make this really clear, what I mean here is Russia at once could instigate the Ukraine conflict and actually pursue it, I think, quite successfully for what they wanted, which is stop Ukraine from entering the EU. At the same time, Sergei Lavrov and his negotiating team in a totally different policy area helped to push the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, over the edge. We know that Russia helped with the JCPOA. So there's international compliance for, in the eyes of the Europeans and the Americans, but there's also, a war going on. Iran at the same time, later on could, negotiate in the JCPOA, but also sponsor proxy conflicts. This hybridity is also something that I think the attendees should pay attention to, is running the business of statecraft in a sort of normal way, diplomacy carries on, while supporting hybrid wars and actually pursuing them. If you put yourself in Russian or Iranian shoes, sustaining this juggling act is actually part of the trick of international relations at a time of transition. And I will mention the USA, don't worry, Benjamin, because the USA is definitely the heavyweight champion of the world still. As I say, a line in my book actually is, the USA has gone from being the undisputed heavyweight champion to the disputed heavyweight champion. We're still in a, broadly speaking, unipolar moment. There's still a gap to be closed in America's military power, certainly in its military spending. But the situation is now very different to when I was an undergraduate, 15, 20 years ago, when there was no competitor. Now there are competitors, but there are also countries like Russia and Turkey who aren't great powers, but they can pursue pretty aggressive gambits in their regions in a way that you'd imagine sort of 20, 25 years ago, an American president would sort of stop somehow, even just by power of words. And that's not because I'm picking on a particular president. I think it's more that the global balance of power is shifting. We know this. And so the possibilities for states with aggressive tendencies or ambition to play a double game, I think, is increasing.
That's a fabulous series of insights that you provided there, Samir. And just to give Ellie a heads up, Ellie, I'm going to actually come to you about a subject I wasn't planning to discuss, which is the JCPOA. But before I do, Noam, these ideas of gambits of deniability and also gambits to increase influence. So Samir spoke about Russia and its operations with Ukraine and its goal, its assessed ambition there of preventing neighboring states from joining the EU or indeed Samir joining NATO as well. But there's another area where Russia is very, very much at play and very much seeking to consolidate its presence and its influence. And of course, unsurprisingly, that is in the Middle East. Russia, you spoke about Syria earlier. Russia is there on the ground in Syria. It's there on the ground in Lebanon. What exactly is Russia doing there? And is it correct to say that Russia is staking out its claim and its place in violation of American influence in the Middle East, perhaps arguably in the face of an American, I wouldn't say retreat, but certainly a stepping away from maximum involvement within the region of late?
Definitely. I think that President Putin understood that he can bring Russia again to a place of a superpower in the Middle East and in Ukraine, etc. And basically, when you look at Russia today, this is a totally corrupt country, a poor country with a poor economy that totally depend on oil, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a superpower. And when you look at the policy of Russia especially in Syria, you can see a very logic approach. And this logic approach is basically all the time talking with the American approach in the Middle East. And basically what Putin and Russia said when they heavily support the Assad regime in the civil war in Syria. They basically said, we do not leave our allies alone. If our allies in the region is under attack, we will support them, even if it's going to be to bomb civilian people. If it's going to be that we will give them a lot of weapon system and ammunition that we know that they're using it against civilians, he doesn't care. And at the end of the day, the big winner of the civil war in Syria is Russia, because Russia become again a superpower in this region. And I can tell you that, you know, when you look, they were ready to risk soldiers, they were ready to risk reputation in this involvement in Syria. And I can say that, you know, you take the American policy, which basically says, bring the troops back home. And I can understand it. You know, we talk about the involvement, the so long involvement in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, etc. And, you know, we are talking with the guys that are doing it on daily basis. You know, Russia said just the opposite. We're going to stay in Syria forever. We have interests there. We have allies there. We are not going anywhere. And this is something which is very, very important to understand. And I think that overall, by those, you know, moves in Syria and in Ukraine and in all those regional wars in Eastern Europe, Russia came back as a superpower.
Well, that's a very, very important perspective. The last question that I want to ask is of you, Eli, and then I just want to encourage our listeners, if you want to ask a question, use the raise hand facility on Zoom or type it into the Q&A box or the chat box at the base of the screen. We're going to be opening to questions in just 3 or 4 minutes after Eli. You come back to Samir's point. Samir made a very important point about the challenge of statecraft writ large. Now, you had this multilateral JCPOA, or commonly known as the Iran deal. One of the knocks against the Iran deal was that while it sought, in some people's eyes successfully, in many other people's eyes unsuccessfully, to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions, it actually proved itself completely unable to curb Iran's malign activities in other areas through other means, and perhaps exposed a lacuna in those nation states to bring to heel a bad actor through traditional statecraft and through treaties. Tell us a little bit about the JCPOA, and if I can ask you to do this without delving into politics per se, what would Israel's perspective about a re-entry into the JCPOA on the part of an incoming administration be from a security perspective? If you could speak about it in those terms, please.
Well, the JCPOA has been very controversial in the relationship between Israel and the negotiating powers with with Iran, and especially our greatest ally, the US. For many people who were advocating for this deal, this was a major diplomatic achievement. And I think that certainly President Obama saw it as part of his diplomatic legacy. He managed to harness the diplomatic assets of America, its relationships with the rest of the powers, and even to bring Russia and China on board and being on the same page as America in the way it treated or regarded the negotiations with Iran. And if you think narrowly about inhibiting Iran or slowing its nuclear program for a decade or 1.5 decades, it is an achievement. But many people in Israel, and especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, have argued that those negotiating powers failed to understand that Iran was not a malign actor when it came to their nuclear ambitions. At the same time, they were trying to achieve or to promote their nuclear program. They had ballistic missiles programs. They were supporting numerous proxy groups all over the Middle East, in Lebanon and in Syria and in Yemen and in Iraq. And they were dealing with many other malign activities, cyber operations across the globe, and many other things. And people, or some of the people who were disagreeing with those negotiating powers said that if you fail to understand that all these efforts are combined, and these are not silos. These are all part of a big plan of Iranian foreign policy. So the whole thing will fail. If you fail to realize that lifting the sanctions that were crippling Iran for so many years and eventually brought them to the negotiating table will allow them only to increase their efforts in all those other directions. And this is in fact what happened. The moment Iran signed the deal in 2015, we could see that suddenly there was a current of Western funding. Western companies were hurrying to Iranian markets. There was a flow of cash into Iran, and all over the Middle East, not only Israel, many of the Gulf countries and other countries, Egypt, were suddenly recognizing increased Iranian efforts to destabilize the region. And for many of the countries in the region, that was a disaster. Now, this is not all people in the region will say that. Even in Israel, many people will say, you can't be too ambitious. The plan, the deal had one specific goal, and it was successful in achieving that goal. But many others will say, even when you talk only about the inhibiting or stopping the nuclear ambitions of Iran, it was just an act of kicking the can down the road, because Iran would eventually have the capabilities of reaching the nuclear bomb. And what we see ever since 2015 or 2018, when the US has withdrawn from the deal, we see that the Iranians are back to their original course of enriching uranium, manufacturing more centrifuges, etc. So that's in a nutshell the differing opinions that were surrounding this deal.
Thank you very much. So we're going to open it to questions now. I'd like to ask, please, if Zach has the first question. Alan, could you facilitate Zach? If he's not available to read out loud, then to speak out loud, then we'll find an alternative way of presenting his questions. But Zach, we'd love to hear your first question.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Benjamin. I just want to say thank the three of you. I appreciate you coming together and doing this. Professor Puri, I know it's about 2 a.m. there for you, so either a late night or an early morning. So appreciate you taking the time to do this. My question is, we're talking about this hybrid warfare, and so what does it really mean for a state like Israel? And to be specific, Professor Puri, you stated the true nature of hybrid warfare is that you aren't able to pin a specific military action on a state. But Israel's in a position where actions by non-state actors generally require a state response. And so what are the international legal implications for Israel if they act on that information and it's still disputed in the public discourse or amongst the international community? And what can the state do to cut through that shroud of doubt and kind of bring the conversation back towards facts over speculation?
And Zach, would you like that to go to Professor Puri to answer first with regard to the inability to pin a specific action on a particular state, and then have Noam and Eli come back? Does that work for you?
That sounds great, Benjamin.
Great. Please, Samir, tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for the question. There's an interesting other phrase for describing hybrid warfare, which my institute, the IISS, has used in one of its recent publications. They call it tolerance warfare, which is a crazy term when you think about it, but what it basically means is you are waging war, engaging kinetic action to the tolerance, the grudging tolerance of your enemies. In other words, you are somewhat the way that Noam was describing earlier, intermittent or sporadic strikes, as you were describing, but they're not really enough to attract a withering response, because there's a pinprick element to them. That's one particular incident. Russia in Ukraine is completely different. There's continuous artillery bombardment, but interestingly, the Russians did not deploy combat air power directly, and especially after the Malaysian airliner MH17 was shot down by the Buk surface-to-air missile, the combat air power in the region I was patrolling in 2014, it was gone. There was no combat air power except for some logistics flights. So that's another way that the Russians were calibrating the level of kinetic action to this quote-unquote tolerance of the international community, the Americans, the Europeans, who are otherwise very angry about the conflict. So that's really the name of the game, is using enough kinetic action, but not too much, and kind of determining where that sort of resides. What can you do about this? Well, I suppose one thing with the question is, it's not so much about winning the rhetorical battle as much as it is withstanding the rhetorical complaints. And I'm not taking a political position one way or the other. I mean, I've got my own strong views about what Russia has done. I've got my own personal opinions about the way Israel has operated its own CT policies. But I think, thinking more about the mechanics of the strategy, what you're trying to actually do is you're trying to give yourself diplomatically or politically or rhetorically enough operational space to carry on with those activities. So if you're Russia, your objective is to stop the Ukrainians from joining the EU. You just want to give yourself the space to do this. And this is where some of this hybridity is actually the relationship between traditional diplomacy and the operational acts on the ground. And that is actually something I think Russia did quite well. For example, facilitating the JCPOA whilst also waging war in Ukraine. So that's how I probably answer that question. I'll round off there, Ben.
So that's an interesting perspective with regard to the Russian bear, but the state of Israel, of course, is in a very different position. I'd like to start off with Noam. Noam, what essentially does hybrid warfare mean for a state like Israel? To come to Zach's question, Professor Puri has spoken very eloquently about its considerations in other theaters, but with regard to the state of Israel, what does this mean for our abilities? I would say, number one, to win out legally, and number two, to actually score a victory in future conflicts, if I could ask those two questions.
I think a very good example is basically Gaza Strip, because Gaza Strip is not a state, but more than 1 million people live there, and they controlled by the Hamas movement, which is a radical Islam movement. On the one hand, they totally depend on Israel in terms of water electricity, goods, etc. On the other hand, they conduct, all kind of attacks, mainly missiles attack to the southern part of Israel once in a while. And every, 3-4 years, we have an operation in Gaza where Israel is using massive force in order to shut it down for a few years until maybe the reality will change and we can move forward to a better time between Israel and Gaza. And we tried a lot of things because for Israel, it is very important. We are Western democracy and our military is fighting according to the international law. And Israel is attacking all the time, that it's basically using too much power. And this also, something of this hybrid war, that you cannot use too much power. If you use too much power, it means you're doing war crimes. And basically, I think that I was involved, and my good partner was Eli, that sit here, because Israel basically tried two things in the operation in Gaza. After one operation, basically, the United Nations nominated the Goldstone to write a report. And this was a terrible false report that basically damaged a lot of the Israeli image in the world, not so much in the United States, but basically in Europe, about that Israel is using too much force and that we are not fighting according to the international law. And this was terrible. So in the next operation, basically the IDF nominated me and people from the very strong and, let's say, combat legal advisors that we have in Israel, and Eli was one of them, one of the leaders. And we built a special mechanism that basically check during the operation almost every incident that we thought that uninvolved people or innocent people were hurt because of Israeli bombs or mortars or tanks, etc. And this was very unique because we were supposed to give quick answers to, let's say, legal issues regard to the international law, use of power in a very crowded area. And here is the issue: when you look at the terror, basically, they use part of this hybrid war. They use rockets that you can launch from crowded area. They camouflage in this urban area. They take you into urban warfare where there is a lot of civilian casualties. And we're talking about the underground, the tunnels, etc. And again, this is something which is dig inside villages and towns. And when you want to fight this type of war, it's always between civilians. It's always in an urban environment when you have women, children, old people, uninvolved people in the scene all the time. And that's why this mechanism was supposed to help the IDF to learn during the operation and to give good answers to the world community why those people were hurt, what is the real story behind the casualties, etc. And I find it very successful in a way that, to be focused that Israel is fighting according to the international law.
Benjamin,
Sorry,
we can't
yes,
hear
you
you.
can hear me. Eli, I don't think that question, though we'll have time for one last question. I don't think that question can be moved on from without asking you to weigh in with regard to the processes that have had to take greater prominence with regard to international law and the law of armed conflict and fire in the context of hybrid warfare. Can you just give us a little bit of insight to that? And then I'm going to move on to what I believe will be our final question, because these are complex questions that we're getting.
Yes, I think Zach was mentioning the use of information in order to justify what you do. He talked about the fact that maybe in the international community there's sometimes doubt about what Israel does, and do we need to share more information in order to deal with facts and not with speculation. And I think that was a very interesting question, because Israel traditionally was very conservative when it came to using intelligence. We were always very good at having the intelligence, but very bad in sharing it and making use of it in the world, in the court of public opinion. But the thing is that conflicts are now fought not only in the battlefield, but also in the media and in social media, and what people think about what you do is very important. And I think what we see in the last years is a new phenomenon in which our leaders are using highly classified intelligence as a tool in foreign relations. We all remember 1.5 or 2 years ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu standing in a press conference with the whole Iranian nuclear archive brought to Israel from Tehran. Now, that would be a highly classified operation. One would not even think about using any piece of information from that archive publicly 10 years ago. And then it was used, it was out in the open, basically was telling the world, look what we have here. The Iranians were lying to the world all along, and this is why we're fighting the nuclear deal. So that was maybe risking Israeli sources, intelligence sources, etc. But that was a brilliant way to use intelligence as a tool. And the same we've seen in the last General Conference of the General Assembly. We saw Prime Minister Netanyahu exposing some facilities of Hezbollah as facilities that they use for manufacturing missiles. He was showing the world high-rises buildings with the civilian residents, where the basements of those buildings were used as factories for manufacturing missiles by Hezbollah. And by that, he was basically, first of all, telling Hezbollah, we know what you're doing, you're exposed, so pay attention to what you're doing. And obviously, it has operational ramifications for them. They now have to move all those facilities somewhere else, etc. But it's also a tool for a discourse with the international community, saying, if God forbid, and we have another round of hostilities with Lebanon, see what the circumstances might be. These are the places where missiles will be manufactured. They will be launched towards Israel. Israel will have to react. And obviously, the fact that there are so many civilians in those areas will have significant collateral damage ramifications. So I think that's a very good example and very good question by Zach.
So we've got a couple of other questions, but I'm going to come to the last one here, because I believe that this really does loop in Samir's expertise as well. And it comes from Captain Micah. Are we able to unmute Captain Micah? And could Captain Micah perhaps read out their question, please? Captain Micah, if you can hear us. If not, I'll proceed and I'll read it out. Captain Micah, are you able to read out the question?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
I hear you clearly. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. So do you agree that hybrid warfare seems to be heavily reliant on influencing information to achieve strategic results? And if so, what important counters to this type of warfare have you seen that are effective to this type of information or war on information? And what about underdeveloped nations with less resources that larger nations may try to take advantage of by trying to help them out against hybrid warfare?
Thank you. I'm going to start with you, Samir, because the reality of the matter is this was an integral part of the Russian effort with regard to Crimea, but it's also an ongoing aspect of the Russians' approach to information campaigns. We see that, by the way, even in terms of household names like RT. Most of the listeners will be aware of RT. This is generally thought of as an information channel for the Russians. If you could take on that question, I'm going to politely ask for short, sharp answers, even though it is a complex question, just so we can bring this in on time.
Absolutely. Well, influence operations are integral to hybrid warfare, but not all influence operations mean that there is a hybrid war going on. One of the mistakes of the term is that because Russia has been so active in propagating its messages and malign influence, some of this is traditional subversion, some of it's sabotage of public opinion, but there needs to be a warfare component for a hybrid war to actually be in place. Quick answer to what works in terms of countering it. I think that the questioner raises a very important point of support to allied nations, especially those with lower capabilities. Sometimes it might be something as basic as being able to provide them with greater capabilities to even to lobby an organization like Facebook or Twitter for taking down of misleading content, or whether it's providing support in terms of getting its own message out there, because its television channels can't compete with RT, for example, and it needs a greater platform. So those are some of the things that could work. But just to round off my answer, in general, it's actually extremely difficult to counter negative messaging, because there's an open marketplace for free opinion, and the internet has pretty much cut down a lot of international boundaries, those that were remaining. Even China's Great Firewall, Hong Kong's protesters found a way around it. So it's very hard to isolate information spaces.
No, Thibault, forgive me. With regard to information campaigns, one organization that was seen as the forefront of that was ISIS. Their strategic goals have been completely inhibited now, but tell us a little bit about what their information campaign was and just how effective it was. Forgive me for sounding a little bit gravelly.
Benjamin, you ask about ISIS?
With regard to information campaigns, we think of them as being, we thought of them as being brilliant in terms of using information to recruit, but their strategic goals were destroyed.
Yeah, I think really ISIS and Hezbollah, they know their audience, and their main goal is to get into the heart of the audience and create huge fear, and to basically to create a situation when you believe them more than you believe your own resources, or your prime minister or the military spokesperson, etc. But frankly, my belief that you cannot win with those kind of operations. So we can see huge operation by cyber, we can see involvement in election, we can see a lot of things happening, but at the end of the day, in my eyes, this is still not a place where you can win a war. This is something which have a very huge effect, mainly on the population, but it is not changing dramatically the decision-making by the leaders.
Thank you very much. And Colonel Baron, Ellie, just a last word on information, if I may. A huge part of the information campaign is presenting the legal basis for various operations in various theaters. But the state of Israel is thought of, if Russia is thought of as being brilliant when it comes to information campaigns, the state of Israel typically has been thought of as being less than brilliant when it comes to information campaigns. How do you see information campaigns playing a central role in the future conflicts of the state of Israel? And also, and I know we're very short on time, so I'm again appealing for a succinct answer. With regards to the United States of America, actually, I remember during previous campaigns, there would be almost daily briefings from the Pentagon about progress within Iraq, for example. And of late, that seems to be wanting. How do you see information campaigns from state actors playing a role in future conflicts?
Well, thank you. I think there's a conflation of ideas when you talk about information in this sense. You mentioned Russia and then you mentioned Israel. I think many people will tell you that Russia has been excellent in disinformation or misinformation campaigns, whereas you asked about Israel and what he does to keep the world, to educate the world about what he does. So it is information campaigns. You cannot just spread misinformation and call it truth, because this is not what democracies do. I think this confrontation between the use of misinformation on one hand, on one party of a conflict, and real information that you need to check and verify before you publish, creates a gap in what you can achieve. For instance, Noam mentioned both Lebanon and Gaza. We've seen both Hezbollah and Hamas using misinformation campaigns. We always remember in Second Lebanon War, we even had a term for the information campaign by Hezbollah. It was called Hezbollywood, because they were actually setting scenes. You could see a bomb building with a brand new Mickey Mouse, with the price tag still on, a sole survivor of the bombing. And it was, the media was very fast in spreading it around the world. And how do you deal with that when you need to check your facts, etc.? And no one was mentioning the fact-finding assessment mechanism he was heading. And I remember that he was his job there was admirable, and it's such a long and arduous process to realize what exactly happened in each incident in an operation. It sometimes takes months to investigate everything, to question all the soldiers involved, to read all the classified materials, to watch the videos and stuff, and only then publish your conclusions. And by then, many times the international community has already forgot about the incident. They only remember that Israel was a culprit of something wrong that went there. So, and there's a saying by Mark Twain that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its boots on. And it's very true in this context. And there's no way, I think in the long run, people have to realize that even though it takes Israel time to release the information, once it's released, it's checked and it's reliable, and Israel is a credible actor. And I think in the long run, it will have benefits. In the short run, there is no real way of fighting misinformation.
Well, thank you very, very much. I want to bring this to a conclusion now. I'd like to express our profound thanks to Fort Gordon, to everybody who's been on this call, to the people who have asked their questions, those who received an answer and those who did not. Special thanks to Captain Kotsis and also to Major Zach Landis. And thank you to our panelists, Major General Noam Tibon, Professor Samir Puri, and Colonel Eli Baron. On behalf of the Miriam Institute, my co-founder, Rosita Panini, and our colleague in common, the great and powerful Alan Langer, we appreciate the time and the expertise of all of you, and we look forward to future collaborations. Thank you very much indeed, and this concludes the session.
Thank you.
Hey, gentlemen, team, this is Captain Kostas. Again, I truly appreciate your time here today. This was an outstanding event. Everything from start to finish was fantastic. So thank you very much for taking the time, especially for those that had to stay up extra late to be a part of this. So we do appreciate your time here because it is all about kind of developing our junior leaders within our military here. So thank you very much. And again, to echo the sentiments of Benjamin, Major Landis, thank you for providing the introductions to this great team so that we can continue to further this relationship, because I think this is going to be a great value added to this course. So again, thank you all very much, and we appreciate your time here today.
Thank you, Captain.
So I will bid you all good night, and we'll be in touch by email, I'm sure. But it's time for bed for me, so good night.
That's 12. Thank you, sir.